The Galactic Council chamber had always been a place of controlled tension, a balance maintained by protocols, mediators, and the careful management of egos. Yet the day humanity withdrew, that balance collapsed into raw disorder. Species that had once leaned on the strange steadiness of humans were left without an anchor. Voices rose above one another in shrill tones, claws and tendrils twitched with agitation, and alliances that had survived centuries suddenly looked brittle. The announcement had been simple and unambiguous. Earth would no longer participate in the Council's diplomacy. No negotiations, no mediators, no treaties signed in their name. The message carried no apology, no justification. It landed like a hammer on stone. For decades, humans had held a peculiar position. They were not the most powerful race, nor the most ancient, nor the most numerous. What they carried was a talent for cutting through pretense. Where other civilizations reveled in ceremony, humans dismantled it with pragmatic clarity. They were the ones who could sit across from warlike predators and convince them to accept compromise, the ones who could mediate between species whose mutual hatred stretched back thousands of years. Their refusal to be intimidated by age-old hierarchies made them uniquely effective. Now, without them, the chamber filled with an unease that no delegate could mask. The ripple effects appeared immediately. A dozen minor disputes, once frozen in delicate balance, began to thaw into open conflict. Systems that relied on humans as neutral negotiators suddenly found themselves without recourse. A trade corridor guarded by unwritten agreements descended into piracy and blockade within days. A long-suppressed border quarrel between two rival empires flared again, both sides emboldened by the absence of the human voice that once held them in check. The Council, so accustomed to leaning on human intervention, discovered how hollow its authority had become without it. Some delegates raged. They accused humans of betrayal, of arrogance, of abandoning their responsibility to the collective. Others spoke with thinly veiled fear, speculating that humanity's withdrawal was not an act of weakness but of calculation. There were whispers that Earth had grown too powerful to need the Council at all, that their fleets had advanced beyond the measure of the old powers, and that leaving diplomacy was only the first step in a larger design. The more these whispers spread, the more panic set in among those who once saw humans as their last defense against predation. Behind the outrage lay a deeper recognition. The Council had never truly respected humanity's contributions. Humans were tolerated, sometimes mocked, often underestimated, but their role as problem solvers had been exploited without acknowledgement. Now that they were gone, the truth became undeniable. They had been indispensable. Each new quarrel, each treaty that dissolved, was a reminder of the stability humanity had once provided. The absence revealed their influence more starkly than their presence ever did. As factions splintered and accusations flew, the Council chamber itself began to lose its function. Meetings that once carried gravity turned into shouting matches. Delegates stormed out mid-session. Proposals dissolved into bickering. Without the human habit of forcing resolutions, the proceedings became theater, words without consequence. The vacuum grew larger each day, pulling the galaxy toward instability. The psychological blow cut just as deeply as the political one. To the oldest empires, the withdrawal was a humiliation, proof that a younger species had judged the Council unworthy of its time. To the weaker races, it was abandonment, leaving them vulnerable to the ambitions of predators. To rivals, it was an opportunity to test the limits of a suddenly weakened order. In every corner of the galaxy, the meaning of humanity's exit was interpreted through fear, resentment, or opportunism, but never indifference. Even as chaos mounted, there was no sign of return. The message from Earth had carried no conditions, no hint of negotiation. It was final. That finality struck harder than any threat could have. Words could be contested, treaties could be renegotiated, but silence and withdrawal left nothing to counter. The Council was forced to confront the reality that the humans had chosen a path outside its authority. That choice shattered the illusion that the Chamber's authority was universal. What emerged from that day was not simply a council without humans. It was a council exposed as fragile, dependent, and incapable of enforcing order on its own. The old system had leaned on humanity more than it cared to admit, and now that crutch had been kicked away. The chamber remained full of voices, but its power was hollow. Where there had once been cautious stability, there was only uncertainty, suspicion, and the creeping sense that the galaxy was sliding toward an era where words would no longer matter at all. For humanity, the withdrawal was not a sudden act but the result of years of discontent layered one atop another until the weight could no longer be ignored. Behind the dignified speeches and carefully worded communiques had been a growing sense of betrayal. From the first day humans entered the council chambers, they were treated as junior partners, apprentices to civilizations that claimed millennia of wisdom. Every statement from Earth had been filtered through condescension, every proposal evaluated less on merit than on the perception that humans were reckless upstarts who had risen too quickly. The tolerance shown to them was never respect, only convenience. That posture had been endurable when the stakes were small, but when lives were lost and colonies threatened, it became intolerable. The record of grievances was long. Earth had repeatedly warned the Council about skirmishes near the frontier, predicting escalations that were brushed aside as paranoia. When human colonies were raided, the Chamber issued statements of regret but no real action. When Earth petitioned for fair terms and resource treaties, they were outvoted by blocs of older empires whose interests aligned in exploiting human mining worlds. The message was clear: humanity was welcome as a participant but never as an equal. In return, humans had poured effort into compromise after compromise, convincing their own people that participation was necessary, that influence could be earned with patience. Yet, each year the evidence grew that patience only bought more humiliation. What truly hardened resolve was the Council's willingness to sacrifice human security for the sake of placating others. A border planet assaulted by a neighboring power became the breaking point. Despite presenting irrefutable proof of aggression, despite showing the graves of civilians, the Council refused to censure the attacker. Instead, it urged restraint on Earth, warning that retaliation would destabilize the region. To human eyes, the hypocrisy was glaring. Those same voices had sanctioned wars when their own interests were touched, yet called for silence when it was humanity that bled. Trust shattered in that moment. Leaders who had spent careers defending cooperation could no longer justify it. The decision to leave was not framed as rebellion or hostility but as necessity. The announcement's wording was cold: humans would not waste lives in debates that produced only more graves. They would no longer accept a system where words were valued above action, where the suffering of their citizens was brushed aside as political inconvenience. The declaration was met with outrage, but it was delivered with finality because it was not aimed at persuasion. It was a statement of reality, one that had been inevitable for years. Internally, the reasoning carried another layer. Humanity had grown. Its industries had expanded beyond dependence. Its fleets had matured into formidable instruments of deterrence. The younger generation of commanders and diplomats saw no reason to keep begging for consideration from powers that dismissed them. The exit from the Council was as much an act of confidence as of frustration. By stepping away, they were proving that survival no longer required validation from those who believed themselves the galaxy's arbiters. For many humans, the withdrawal was a liberation. Citizens remembered every time their concerns had been silenced in the chamber, every treaty that cost them more than it gave. The knowledge that their leaders had finally placed Earth's survival and dignity above the endless rituals of compromise sparked a rare sense of unity. For the first time in decades, the population felt that their destiny was not subject to the whims of ancient empires who measured loyalty in terms of obedience. To outside observers, the withdrawal seemed rash, even dangerous. Yet to humanity it was the most rational choice. They had tried words. They had offered patience. They had endured insult. None of it earned them safety. Action was the only path left. The empty seats in the council chamber were not a threat but a symbol, a silent declaration that Earth's fate would be shaped by its own hands. What remained behind was a void, but it was a void humanity no longer intended to fill. Without humanity's steadying influence, fractures within the Galactic Council widened into deep chasms. The first signs were subtle: delays in routine agreements, trade convoys rerouted through less reliable channels, whispers of skirmishes along forgotten borders. Within weeks, those small tremors became undeniable shocks. Old rivalries, once restrained by the constant pressure of human pragmatism, resurfaced with startling speed. Races that had kept their animosity confined to rhetoric now unleashed fleets. Minor star systems, caught between larger powers, became contested zones overnight. Merchants who once relied on the Council's assurances found themselves stranded when protection vanished. Pirates and opportunists thrived in the absence of coordinated enforcement. Blockades formed around strategic routes, imposed not by law but by raw force. Entire economies trembled as goods piled up in warehouses, unable to reach destinations. The delicate web of trust that sustained interstellar commerce unraveled strand by strand. Many species realized too late how often it had been human negotiators who ensured contracts were honored and disputes resolved before violence erupted. The council chamber descended into dysfunction. Sessions once filled with cautious debate devolved into accusations and shouting. Delegates stormed out in fury, returning only to deliver ultimatums. Words that had once been tempered by the human presence were now sharpened into threats. Some species demanded emergency sanctions against rivals, others insisted on military intervention that the Council had no capacity to enforce. The body that prided itself on being the voice of galactic order began to resemble a stage for grievances no one intended to solve. Without human persistence to hammer out middle ground, no compromise survived more than a few hours. For the weaker civilizations, the collapse was terrifying. Many had depended on human persistence to keep stronger neighbors at bay. Their pleas for protection were drowned out in the din of larger empires clashing over territory and pride. Desperation drove them to seek allies wherever they could find them, but alliances formed in haste only deepened instability. Small coalitions rose and fell in rapid succession, none able to withstand the pressures of constant betrayal. A sense of abandonment spread, as if the galaxy itself had turned hostile to those without fleets large enough to defend themselves. Meanwhile, rumors about humanity's motives gained strength. Spies reported that Earth was investing heavily in its fleets, drilling its soldiers with unrelenting discipline, and pouring resources into advanced technology. While council worlds were paralyzed by argument, human colonies were fortifying, industries expanding, and trade networks redirected under their own protection. The contrast was stark. To outsiders, it seemed less like retreat and more like preparation. Every report of human efficiency stoked suspicion that they had left diplomacy not from weakness but from confidence in their growing independence. That suspicion bred fear. Some delegates whispered that humanity might exploit the Council's turmoil to expand its influence unchecked. Others argued that humans no longer cared for galactic stability, and that this apathy was even more dangerous. Every interpretation led to the same conclusion: humanity's absence was destabilizing not only the chamber but the very psychology of its members. Where once there had been an expectation that disputes could be mediated, there was now only mistrust. The longer the void remained, the deeper the fractures grew. Trade continued to collapse, border wars escalated, and the Council's reputation dwindled into irrelevance. What had once been a symbol of cooperation became a hollow theater of quarrels. Each passing day made it clearer that the structure had leaned far more heavily on human involvement than any species wanted to admit. Without their relentless insistence on resolution, the entire framework sagged under the weight of its contradictions. By the end of the first year without humans, the galaxy no longer believed in the Chamber's authority. It had become a room filled with voices, but none carried force. Outside, fleets moved without restraint, alliances shifted overnight, and the weak braced themselves for predation. The Council remained, but its influence was gone. In the silence left by humanity's departure, the galaxy discovered that the absence of one voice could drown out all the rest. While the Council struggled to hold together, humanity moved in a direction that revealed a sharp contrast between paralysis and progress. Freed from the endless debates that once consumed its representatives, Earth redirected its energy inward and outward simultaneously, strengthening its core while extending influence into regions long neglected by the old order. Instead of waiting for consensus, they acted with clarity. Colonies that once pleaded for recognition in the chamber now received immediate support from their own fleets. Trade routes vulnerable to piracy were secured by patrols flying human banners. Where the Council faltered in indecision, humans filled the vacuum with decisiveness. This transition was not purely military. Industrial capacity expanded at a pace that shocked observers. Shipyards ran continuously, producing not only warships but merchant vessels, mining rigs, and infrastructure carriers. Human engineering emphasized versatility, enabling one design to serve multiple roles depending on circumstance. That flexibility became a defining strength, allowing them to outpace species whose rigid traditions hindered adaptation. At the same time, their colonies developed into hubs of resilience. Harsh environments that others deemed unsuitable were transformed into thriving settlements through sheer persistence. Each success reinforced the perception that humans excelled where others hesitated. Recognizing the growing instability, smaller civilizations began turning toward Earth for stability. Diplomatic missions, once dismissed in the Chamber, now sought entry into what became informally known as the Coalition of Earth and Allies. Unlike the Council, which buried requests under layers of procedure, humanity set clear terms: mutual defense, fair trade, and respect for sovereignty. The simplicity of this framework attracted partners weary of exploitation. Systems that had felt abandoned discovered that human fleets responded quickly to distress calls, and that agreements signed with Earth were honored without manipulation. Trust, once eroded in the Council, found new ground to grow. This coalition gained momentum because it operated on action rather than rhetoric. Pirates were driven out of corridors where human escorts appeared. Stations plagued by neglect were supplied and rebuilt. Merchants reported that under human protection, goods arrived intact and on time. These tangible results mattered more than the grand speeches echoing in the Council's chambers. Stability, not ceremony, became the hallmark of human-led cooperation. The contrast was so sharp that even species once skeptical began to reconsider their alliances. Culturally, this shift resonated deeply within humanity itself. Citizens who had long felt their voices stifled in galactic politics now saw proof that independence brought dignity. Media across Earth and its colonies celebrated achievements not as conquests but as vindications of self-reliance. The narrative of a people no longer bound by the arrogance of ancient powers became a unifying theme. Generational pride grew from the knowledge that they had chosen their own path and made it work. That sense of purpose fueled further innovation and ambition, feeding a cycle of progress that the Council could not match. Observers outside the coalition took notice with mixed emotions. Some viewed the rising influence as a challenge to the old order, others as a beacon of stability in a darkening galaxy. What no one could deny was that humanity had turned withdrawal into opportunity. By refusing to entangle itself in endless disputes, it freed resources to build a system that functioned. The message was clear: their strength did not rely on recognition from the Council, but on their ability to deliver security and prosperity to those who trusted them. The success of this alternative structure exposed the Council's decline more starkly than its own failures ever could. Every functioning trade lane protected by humans highlighted the chaos elsewhere. Every colony thriving under coalition membership underscored the misery of those trapped in the Council's collapsing framework. What had begun as a desperate act of walking away evolved into proof that humanity could offer something the Chamber never could: order rooted in action, not ceremony. By the time the Council realized what was happening, the shift had already become irreversible. Humanity had stopped asking for a seat at someone else's table. They had built their own, and others were lining up to join. The inevitable collapse arrived not with a single dramatic event but through the steady erosion of what little credibility the Council still possessed. Rival empires that had once restrained their aggression openly deployed fleets against one another. A conflict that began as a dispute over mineral rights escalated into a full-scale war, dragging dozens of systems into devastation. Refugees fled in waves, overwhelming neutral stations, many of which lacked the resources to cope. Desperate populations looked for protection, and more often than not, their eyes turned toward the human sphere. Earth's coalition had already proven itself capable of order, and in chaos that competence became irresistible. The Chamber that once prided itself as the voice of unity degenerated into little more than a hollow stage. Attendance dwindled as delegates concluded there was no purpose in gathering. Those who remained did so only to deliver accusations or to record grievances that would never be resolved. The illusion of authority had shattered completely. No one expected the Council to prevent wars, to protect trade, or even to enforce its own decrees. Its relevance withered in full view of the galaxy. The seats humans once occupied became symbolic, reminders of the moment the system began its death spiral. Meanwhile, Earth issued only a single statement, delivered without ornamentation. It reminded the galaxy that humans had offered diplomacy for decades, and that their patience had been answered with exploitation and indifference. The declaration emphasized that they would not return to a chamber that valued ceremony over justice. Survival, it said, was now the responsibility of each civilization, and only those willing to act decisively would endure. The clarity of that message struck harder than condemnation ever could. It did not threaten, it did not boast, it simply articulated the truth. The old order was finished, and humanity no longer cared to rescue it. For those outside the coalition, the realization carried both dread and resignation. Species that had dismissed humans as rash now found themselves wishing for their return. Others, once smug in their superiority, discovered too late that their arrogance had blinded them to how essential human persistence had been. Now, with wars burning and trade shattered, they faced the consequences of that dismissal. The weak scrambled for shelter, the strong tore at each other's throats, and none could deny that the absence of one species had unbalanced the entire structure. Inside human territory, the contrast was stark. Fleets drilled with precision, colonies expanded with discipline, and industries surged. Citizens spoke of a future not bound by the failings of others, but defined by their own determination. The coalition they built attracted more partners, creating a parallel system that functioned while the Council rotted. Humanity did not gloat. They did not need to. Their existence as a stable force in a collapsing galaxy was proof enough. Where others descended into anarchy, they thrived. The Council's last sessions dissolved into silence. Entire delegations stopped sending representatives. The chamber, once overflowing with debate, became a cavern echoing with absence. Records marked resolutions passed without effect, votes taken without enforcement, speeches delivered to empty rows. What had been the galaxy's grandest institution became a monument to its own irrelevance. And through it all, humanity never returned. The reckoning was not a triumphant conquest but a quiet verdict. The galaxy had been given a chance to share in stability and squandered it. Humanity had chosen survival on its own terms and proved it was possible. The collapse of the Council was the natural consequence of arrogance and dependence, while the rise of human independence was the natural reward of resilience. The story did not end with Earth dominating others, but with Earth walking forward unburdened, leaving behind a hall of voices that no longer mattered. In the end, the chaos was not created by human withdrawal but revealed by it. Their departure stripped away the illusion that the Council had ever been stable without them. By leaving, humanity demonstrated that true strength lay not in endless words but in decisive action. As their fleets charted new courses into the stars, the galaxy watched, divided between fear and admiration. What remained certain was that the humans had rewritten the measure of power, not by conquering, but by refusing to bow, and by thriving when the rest crumbled.